I wonder how much time we've had or we've taken to stop and think over the last 6 months. I don't know about you, but for me, the events around the COVID crisis, which is still unfolding, has been all about reacting. Something happens and you need to react. You need to react immediately. There has to be an immediate solution to whatever is going on. And in a weird way, I think the last 6 months has seen life both slow down and speed up. I looked at the calendar and it tells me that it's November, and I kind of wonder, how on earth have we got here? The last time I looked at the calendar it was March, and suddenly it's November. Where has all the time gone? Today we're going to hear from a challenge to God's people when time kind of disappears and none of the important stuff seems to have happened. We're going to be looking at a prophet called Haggai. Haggai is a tiny book, really near the end of the Old Testament. It's just 2 chapters long, and it records 4, I guess you would call them mini sermons given by this prophet Haggai between August and December in 520 BC. The timing's just about right for us. And Haggai is a single issue kind of a guy. Haggai only has one thing on his mind, and that one thing is all that he preaches about. Rebuilding the house of the Lord. That's it. No calls for justice, no description of God dwelling with his people who love him, none of the stuff that we expect from prophets. He is a one single sermon series kind of a guy. All that he's interested in getting over to people is a building project. Now here we are at the beginning of November. The weather's been pretty miserable this week. The news has been pretty miserable this week. Life for many people is not that easy at the moment. And here I am saying to you that we're going to be thinking about a building project. And maybe you're thinking to yourselves, oh, come on, Julie, this just isn't the time. Except the more that I think about it, the more I think this absolutely is the time. Haggai's passion was for rebuilding the temple of the Lord. Not because he liked splendid architecture and not because a building is something that he worshipped. I think Haggai could say with King David, Lord, I love the house where you live, the place where your glory dwells. I love that there's a place which helps me to see your glory, which helps me to worship you and helps me to honour you. I love the house where you live. It's a statement of commitment, a statement of care, not for a building, but for the presence of God. To be in your presence matters to me, and it should matter to your people, and that is what I think is Haggai's view. I expect, probably as God's people, we would agree with that. Of course being in the presence of God matters, of course worship matters, of course building a place which honours God matters. I think we would all say yes to that. Let me ask you though, if you were to look over the last 6 months, would honouring God, would seeking his presence, would building his worship be something that was a priority for you? Or would it be something that was kind of an afterthought, not exactly neglected, but something that just wasn't quite a priority? The temple was an important part of Jewish worship. The temple, the altar, the things that they could see and touch in the building all helped them to focus on God. It's the same way as a Bible or a cross or bread and wine help us to focus on God. But when we had the opportunity to share bread and wine in communion a couple of weeks ago together, how many people actually made it their priority? I can tell you, not that many. When God's people returned to their land, it was with a really clear instruction to rebuild the temple. And as we saw a few weeks ago, the people started out with a lot of enthusiasm. Yes, let's build, not for the sake of a building, but for the sake of worship. That's why they started with the altar, and we saw that in Ezra 3. But pretty much soon things got harder. Reality hit. Trying to build homes, trying to plant fields, building the temple, dealing with people trying to discourage them. It all together made keeping going an awful lot harder. And as days turned to weeks, and weeks turned to months, and months turned to years, the temple was still not built. In fact, by the time Haggai starts to preach, it's been 14 years since the foundations of the temple were laid, and nothing else has been built. Because you see, by the time Haggai was raised up by God to speak to his people, the people had become settled in the way things were. The new normal was normal. It wasn't new anymore. And no one had the energy or the motivation or the desire to create anything better. The temple was still a charred ruin, but it was okay because they could have some kind of worship there. The land suffered some years of drought and famine, but they get by. Leaders from Persia as well as closer to home were keeping the people down, but it's okay, we'll manage. The new normal was very much what life was all about. But God, through Haggai, had something to say about that.
In the 2nd year of King Darius, on the 1st day of the 6th month, the word of the Lord came through the prophet Haggai to Zerubbabel, son of Shealtiel, governor of Judah, and to Joshua, son of Jozadak, the high priest. This is what the Lord Almighty says. These people say, the time has not yet come to rebuild the Lord's house. Then the word of the Lord came through the prophet Haggai. Is it a time for you yourselves to be living in your panelled houses, while this house remains a ruin? Now this is what the Lord Almighty says. Give careful thought to your ways. You have planted much but harvested little. You eat but never have enough. You drink but never have your fill. You put on clothes but are not warm. You earn wages only to put them in a purse with holes in it. This is what the Lord Almighty says. Give careful thought to your ways. Go up into the mountains and bring down timber and build my house, so that I may take pleasure in it and be honoured, says the Lord. You expect much, but see, it turned out to be little. What you brought home, I blew away. Why, declares the Lord Almighty? Because of my house, which remains a ruin, while each of you is busy with your own house. Therefore, because of you, the heavens have withheld their dew and the earth its crops. I called for a drought on the fields and the mountains, on the grain, the new wine, the olive oil, and everything else the ground produces, on people and livestock, and on all the labour of your hands. Then Zerubbabel, son of Shealtiel, Joshua, son of Jozadak, the high priest, and the whole remnant of the people obeyed the voice of the Lord their God, and the message of the prophet Haggai, because the Lord their God had sent him, and the people feared the Lord. Then Haggai, the Lord's messenger, gave this message of the Lord to the people. I am with you, declares the Lord. So the Lord stirred up the spirit of Zerubbabel, son of Shealtiel, governor of Judah, and the spirit of Joshua, son of Jozadak, the high priest, and the spirit of the whole remnant of the people. Then they came and began to work on the house of the Lord Almighty their God, on the 24th day of the 6th month.
I wonder what the last 6 months have been like for you. Have you just been getting by as best you can, or have you been able to find the space or the time to stop, to pause, and to think about what's been going on? I suspect that for many of us, we look at where we've got to now, we look at what we're doing, and we think to ourselves, wow, how on earth did I get here? Where have the last 6 months gone to? Not because it's either good or bad, but just because we've been so busy that we haven't had the time to pause and to stop and to think. Like I said before, Haggai is a single issue kind of a guy. He has one thing on his mind, and that is rebuilding the temple of the Lord. But he's talking to a people who have had to deal with all kinds of trouble and all kinds of hardship over the years. The building project has stalled. It's been 14 years since anyone has done any work on God's house. The foundation is all that's been laid. Everything else is still a charred ruin. And Haggai has some things to say about that. And if the passage sounded kind of familiar to you, it really should, because we looked at this passage back in February, just before lockdown, when we were thinking about our Old Testament people, and we were thinking particularly about Zerubbabel. And it was interesting to me as I prepared this week to come back to a passage that we've looked at reasonably recently, and to think whether it has something different to say to us because our circumstances have changed. I think it says, of course, a lot of the same things to us as it did when we looked at it back in February. But maybe because we're in this COVID time, because we're in this more difficult time than we were in February, it perhaps emphasises something different. Twice in our passage, God says the same thing. He gives his people an instruction. This is what the Lord Almighty says: give careful thought to your ways, or consider your ways. Think about the path you're on. Think about where you've come from. Think about where you're going, and give it careful thought. Consider your ways. It's literally put to heart the paths that you're on, where you've come from, and also where you're going. Life for the people of God has been all about survival ever since they've come back to the land. Coming back to a destroyed land and trying to get the farmland productive again. Despite droughts, despite famine, they've tried to do that. Coming back to a ruined city and a ruined temple and trying to rebuild despite the discouragements and the opposition from the people round about them. Coming back to their land and just trying to live and to be a people, even although they are still under some sort of rule from the Persian Empire. And God is saying, off the back of all of this stuff, stop. Take a minute. Consider the path that you are on. Consider your ways. Look at where your steps have come from. Look at where they're going, and give that some thought. And at a time when maybe getting by sometimes feels as much as we can manage, I think God asks us to stop. I think in reading this passage, God says to us, stop and think about where you've come from and where you're going. And there's three things which I think Haggai is telling us to consider when we consider our ways. The first thing I think he's telling us to do is to consider our excuses. Life hasn't been easy for the last 6 months. I'm not even going to pretend like life has been easy for the last 6 months. Work, if you have it, has been intense and maybe quite stressful and demanding. If you don't have work, if you're looking for work, it's been really difficult even to figure out what work might look like in this COVID or post-COVID world. Studies are so different that it's hard to find focus or to figure out even how to concentrate on studying. And sometimes life, family life, relationships have kind of shrunk because of the restrictions that we forget what it's like even to be with other people. It's been hard for a lot of people. And so when it comes to our church life, our worship life, we kind of say, I just can't cope with anything else. Don't give me anything else to think about, and certainly don't give me anything else to do. We'll get by as we are. This is the wrong time. It's the wrong time for me to get involved in something else for church. I'm only just managing with life stuff. Don't make me do church stuff too. And it's the same reasoning that we saw with God's people back in Haggai's time. And this is what God said to them. This is what the Lord Almighty says. These people say, the time has not yet come to rebuild the Lord's house. The timing is right, says God's people. Now I find this a really interesting argument, because you see, when the people came back from Babylon, the king of Babylon, King Cyrus, said it was time for God's people to rebuild the temple. Cyrus, he wasn't someone who worshipped God, he wasn't part of the people of God, and yet he said it is the right time for God's people to go back to their land and to rebuild their temple. And the people had a choice. Some people chose to go back to the land and start to rebuild, and some people chose to stay where they were in Babylon. And those people who went back to the land must have thought it was the right time to go. If they didn't think it was the right time, they could have stayed in Babylon. So what's changed? If the timing was right when they first came back to the land, how come the people are now saying the timing's not right? To my mind, the only thing that's changed is the reality of their task. Their commitment, what they've signed up for, has hit them. Yes, we'll rebuild, they said. But then they get back to Jerusalem and they find the temple is just this burned out, charred ruin. They find a deserted city. They find farmland destroyed. And suddenly that commitment that felt okay back in Babylon doesn't feel so doable now. And so the excuses start to come. And the thing with excuses is, they're very often based on reality, on how people are feeling. It's hard. I'm struggling. We'll get by with what we've got. The thing is though, this is what people are saying about rebuilding the house of God. It's not just some general building project. It is rebuilding God's place of worship. And I think their excuses come from two different places. The first place I think their excuse comes from, and our excuses come from, is forgetting what God wants from us. So the people are saying it's not right for the temple to be built. These are the very same people who came back with the express purpose of building the temple. They've forgotten what they're about. They've forgotten why they're there. And I wonder sometimes, in the difficulties and the stresses of the last 6 months, have these made us forgetful? We are God's people. We are called to build his worship, not just to take part in it, but to commit ourselves to building his place of worship, which for us at the moment is online. In the last 6 months, God's purposes for his people haven't changed. The world around us has changed beyond all recognition, but God's purposes for his people to be a worshipping community haven't changed. Consider your excuses. The second thing though, I think, which brings excuses is discouragement. So a couple of weeks ago we heard about the people setting out to rebuild the altar of God. Worship was a priority for them, and they did what they could, more or less straight away. It wasn't easy. There were potential difficulties to overcome. There were fears to overcome. They had to set up new homes in this destroyed land. They had to face people who were bringing opposition and fear to them. But despite all of this, once they got their homes set up, once they got settled, their next priority was building the altar of God. Amid all the ruins of the temple, they did everything they could to set up worship. And fear and opposition and difficulty, that wasn't an issue, because worship mattered, and they would do anything to make it happen. But as we saw last week, discouragement sets in. There is real active opposition to the rebuilding of the temple. And it's easy to say, oh wow, timing's all wrong. Look at all this opposition. Timing's all wrong. It's too hard a job. And we get discouraged. The opposition, the discouragement is real. There's no question about it. The people really were trying to stop them from building the temple, but it can also be an excuse. Right at the beginning, they were prepared to face the opposition, to build the altar, to start building the temple. But after a while, they then say, nah, it's too much, and it becomes an excuse. Things get harder, and it becomes an excuse. We say, let's stop. We forget what God has called us to in the first place. I think it's really easy to find excuses when we don't want to do what God asks of us. We can rationalise it away. Oh, the timing's not right, I've got other priorities. Maybe when things settle down, maybe when there's less opposition. Haggai's first words to the people is stop with the excuses. Face up to what God is calling you to do. The second thing I think Haggai calls us to do is to think about our priorities. So Haggai says to the people, then the word of the Lord came through the prophet Haggai. Is it a time for you yourselves to be living in your panelled houses, while this house, God's house, remains a ruin? Panelled houses don't necessarily mean fancy houses with nice posh wood panelling or anything like that. In fact, most of the people who would have returned to the land would have been just poor farmers. Panelled houses means covered houses or houses with roofs on them. Houses that are complete. Houses that are finished. There wasn't still work to be done. They had rebuilt their place. But they left the temple of God as a foundation, nothing built on it, definitely nothing complete. I wonder why they did that. Why did those people who were so keen to rebuild that place of worship as soon as they came back to the land, why did they end up focusing their priorities on themselves and not on God? I think it's quite easy to drift away from God's priorities to our own. We don't even know we're doing it. It's something that just kind of happens as a drift, especially I think when life is hard. People, they didn't come back to a comfortable life in Jerusalem. They came back to a broken down city, a broken down land, a broken down temple. And they said to themselves, okay, let's get my stuff sorted. And then when I've got some time left over, I'll give that to God. It's kind of understandable. I get their thinking. And maybe you get it too. Maybe you can relate to that kind of thinking. Let me just about hold it together. And with anything I've got left, I'll give it to God. But God says, give careful thought to your ways. Go up into the mountains and bring down timber and build my house so that I may take pleasure in it and be honoured, says the Lord. Give careful thought to your ways. Don't just get on with your own things. Don't just do as you're told. He says, give careful thought to your ways. Put your heart to your paths. Put your heart to the paths you've walked. Put your heart to the path that you're going to walk along, and think about whether you've got your priorities right. Think about these last 6 hard months. These months that we're facing as well. Think about whether we got our priorities right in those last 6 months, and whether we have our priorities right in the 6 months to come. Because God then says to his people, go up to the mountains, get the timbers that are needed to build my house. Make that a priority. Not just a priority in your mind, but in your actions. So don't just think about building the house of the Lord. Go out to the mountains, cut down timbers and bring them to actually do it. Get to work. Get going. That's what we're going to be thinking about next week. And we do that not because it's what we are told to do, but because we've considered our ways and we want to build that place of worship which is pleasing for God. We want to build a place where God is honoured. Getting by isn't enough. We need to consider and to prioritise. We want to create lives which praise and honour God, places which glorify God. Connected with considering our priorities, the last thing I think Haggai tells us to do is to consider our busyness. When God's people got back to Jerusalem and when Haggai was speaking to them, they weren't kicking back in their fancy houses, lazily doing nothing. They were busy. They were busy people working just to keep life going, just to keep it together. And yet all that busyness brought them no satisfaction. This is what the Lord Almighty says: give careful thought to your ways. You have planted much but harvested little. You eat but never have enough. You drink but never have your fill. You put on clothes but are not warm. You earn wages only to put them in a purse with holes in it. These people are facing famine, they're facing drought, they're facing economic uncertainty. It all sounds very familiar, right? And they're doing what they can to keep it together. Of course they are, because these things are important. That's what we're doing now. The thing is though, in all their busyness and all their keeping it together, God has been edged out. Why worry about God? Why worry about worship when reality is dictated by famine and drought and poverty? And in those kinds of circumstances, giving time to worshipping God, that feels like a luxury rather than a necessity. And maybe that's how a lot of us are feeling at the moment. Pressures of time, pressures of keeping things together, pressures of work mean that building God's house, building worship, feels like a luxury rather than a necessity. The thing is though, hard though the people are working at keeping it together, there's still no satisfaction in what they're doing. They're alive, but they're not really living. Something is missing in what they're doing. And the very thing they have edged out of life, God, is what is missing and what is essential for life. So Haggai goes on to say, you expected much, but see, it turned out to be little. What you brought home I blew away. Why, declares the Lord Almighty? Because of my house, which remains a ruin, while each of you is busy with his own house. Each of you is busy with your own thing, but my house, my temple, the place which allows you to focus your worship on me, it's a ruin. It's still broken down. And when God was neglected, nothing quite worked right. They tried to make things right, but it just never quite happened. No matter how busy the people were, things just didn't quite work. Now, I'm not suggesting that on top of trying to cope and manage with COVID living, we add some kind of guilt about not serving God, or we stress ourselves out by being even more busy. Life's hard enough without adding more burdens to life at the moment. What I am saying though is to look at how busy we are and to see if we're busy in the right way, to see if our focus is in the right place and on the right things. Has our busyness edged God out of our living? What can each of us bring, not just me, what can each of us bring to the building of God's worship in our present circumstances? What can each of us bring? Haggai's first sermon had some pretty sharp things to say to the people, and they needed to decide how to respond to him. This is what happened. Verse 12 tells us, Then Zerubbabel, son of Shealtiel, Joshua, son of Jozadak, the high priest, and the whole remnant of the people obeyed the voice of the Lord their God and the message of the prophet Haggai, because the Lord their God had sent him, and the people feared the Lord. Zerubbabel, Joshua, everyone obeyed what God said to them through Haggai. Everyone. Not just the leaders, not just a few people, but the whole community united in their response and in their obedience. It's all about unity. It's all about people together, considering their ways and making a response to what God said. It's about those people turning to God and obeying him, even when they had turned away from him before. It's about giving them their priorities, obeying God. It's about fearing him, giving him the honour and the awe that he deserves. And it's only once this new mindset is in place that God reminds them of a promise. Haggai, the Lord's messenger, gave this message of the Lord to the people. I am with you, declares the Lord. I am with you. It's a promise to God's people that echoes over centuries. I am with you, said God to Moses as he struggles to be a leader of this new people of God. I am with you, says God to Joshua as he's about to take the people into the promised land. I am with you, says God to Jehoshaphat as he faces up to all kinds of armies coming to destroy God's people. I am with you, says Jesus to his followers as he calls them to go and to make disciples. I am with you is the constant promise of Scripture. And sometimes maybe we need to hear it again. It's been 14 years since the temple foundations were laid. 14 years which have included discouragements and infighting and famine and poor crops. It wasn't an easy time. But God's reminder to his people is, I am with you. Maybe that's something you need to hear today. In all the challenges and all the changes of the last 6 months, do you need to hear and take to heart God's promise? I am with you. He's not just with us though, he's working in us. The end of our passage tells us, the Lord stirred up the spirit of Zerubbabel, son of Shealtiel, governor of Judah, and the spirit of Joshua, son of Jozadak, the high priest, and the spirit of the whole remnant of the people. They came and began to work on the house of the Lord Almighty, their God. Remember a couple of weeks ago when we first thought about the people returning to the land in Ezra 1? We discovered a bit of stirring up from God. God stirred up the heart of Cyrus, king of Persia, to make the decree that would allow the people to go home. And God stirred up the hearts of the people who chose to come back to Jerusalem. And now here again, we have God doing some stirring up in his people. And the question for us today, I think, is, how is God stirring you up? What is God stirring in your heart, in my heart, in our hearts? Like God's people back then, maybe we get some things wrong. Maybe as we consider our ways in the last 6 months and we consider our ways to come, we've got things wrong. But it's not the end of the story. Consider your ways, says God. Not just where you've come from, but where you're going. And as you do that, remember that I am with you.